Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Before we even really get started today, I just want to ask you, the listener, to please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show.
It really does make a huge difference for us.
It does. It helps us keep doing what we do, bringing you these deep explorations into the ideas that are really shaping our world right now. And man, today we have a truly massive one for you.
We really do.
We are reviewing a highly provocative, deeply polarizing, and just incredibly comprehensive new ebook. It's called Beyond Feminism, Restoring Balance in Institutions, and it's by Conrad Reicher.
It is a heavy text.
Very heavy. Now, for you listeners who are, say, deeply engaged in men's rights advocacy, or those of you tuned into the manosphere, or really anyone who's just interested in understanding the history of our institutions before what the author describes as their capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies, well, this deep dive is going to be incredibly insightful for you. And I want to say right up front, if you want to read this book yourself, and you probably will after we get through this, you can buy it right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend checking it out if you want to see the raw data we'll be discussing.
Yeah, and you should also absolutely go follow the author at Conrad Reicher on Substack. That's at ConradReiker on Substack. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to thoroughly examine Reicher's extensive arguments.
Right.
We're going to look at his claims about how modern institutions, from education to the corporate world, the legal system, the media, how they've been fundamentally altered by these ideologies. And of course, how he believes men can navigate this landscape to reclaim their roles.
Exactly. But before we dive into the actual text, we really need to establish some very clear ground rules for today's discussion.
Good idea.
Because this source material is highly politically charged. It touches on issues that are intensely debated in our current cultural climate. So we want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we endorsing any specific political wing, left or right. Our job here is strictly analytical. We're simply going to impartially report on the content provided in this ebook, synthesize Reicher's core arguments, and help you understand the underlying framework of the text.
Yeah, think of us as your tour guides through a very complex, very controversial intellectual landscape.
Perfectly said. We are here to map out the terrain Reicher presents, examine the evidence he uses to support his claims, and just explore the logical conclusions of his arguments so that you can evaluate them for yourself.
I'm really glad we laid that out because the architecture of his argument is dense, and he comes out swinging right in part one.
He doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't. The bedrock of his entire thesis is what he identifies as the crisis of modern masculinity. He starts with this incredibly stark premise that men are currently experiencing a profound crisis, essentially feeling like second-class citizens in a society that actively vilifies traditional male roles.
Yes, and he doesn't just leave it at, philosophical musings.
Right.
He comes right out with a very heavy data point, which is that men account for nearly 80% of all suicides.
Which is just a staggering number when you hear it said out loud.
It is, and he uses that statistic as the anchor for his entire first chapter. For Reicher, that 80% figure isn't just a tragic anomaly. It's the ultimate symptom of a much larger systemic issue. It's basically the canary in the coal mine, indicating a deep underlying despair and alienation that he attributes directly to how modern society treats men.
Wait, let me push back on that for a second, just to test his logic.
Sure.
When he looks at an 80% male suicide rate and blames it directly on cultural shifts regarding masculinity, how does he rule out other massive factors?
Like what?
Like economic downturns, the loss of manufacturing jobs, or the opioid crisis. Does he address those variables at all?
That's a great question. And yeah, he does acknowledge economic factors. But he argues that the response to those economic factors is heavily gendered.
What does that mean exactly?
He posits that when a man loses his job in a factory, it's not just a loss of income. Because society still quietly demands that men be providers while simultaneously punishing them for traditional masculine pride. The psychological toll is uniquely devastating for a man.
I see.
He points to a series of societal double standards that create just an impossible environment. For instance, he discusses the emotional double bind. Men are constantly told to man up, right?
Right, be stoic.
Exactly, to absorb pressure without complaint. But at the exact same time, modern culture heavily criticizes them for not being emotionally available or vulnerable enough.
And then when they finally do show that vulnerability,
Yes. When they do express frustration or fear, Riker argues their emotions are often dismissed or even weaponized against them. He points out the hypocrisy in our modern cultural lexicon, specifically zeroing in on terms like mansplaining.
Right, I wanted to bring that up. He argues that concepts like mansplaining aren't just, internet buzzwords. They are actively weaponized tools used to silence men in conversations.
That's his claim.
It creates an environment where a man's input is immediately viewed with suspicion or hostility simply because of his gender. It's an instant disqualifier in a debate.
What's fascinating here is how Riker points to the erasure of male-only spaces as a primary catalyst for this resulting isolation.
The spaces where they used to be able to talk about this.
Exactly. Historically, whether it was sports clubs, men's groups, fraternal organizations, or even just local neighborhood bars acting as de facto male spaces, these were environments where men could bond.
Right.
They could share struggles, joke around, and build camaraderie without the constant pressure of performing for or navigating the complex social rules of mixed gender dynamics.
And those spaces are largely gone now, or they've been forcibly integrated.
Precisely. Riker argues that the systematic dismantling of these spaces, often under the banner of inclusivity or through accusations that any exclusive male gathering naturally promotes toxic masculinity, it's left men profoundly isolated.
They lost their buffer.
They've lost the critical informal support networks that traditionally acted as a buffer against the exact kind of despair that leads to that catastrophic 80% suicide statistic.
To really drive this home, he brings in some very specific illustrative anecdotes. He doesn't just rely on the macro data.
No, he grounds it in narrative.
Yeah. He tells the story of James, for example. James is a guy working in a corporate office who gets passed over for a promotion.
Right.
And according to the text, he isn't passed over because someone else had a better track record. He was passed over in favor of a less qualified female colleague, specifically because the company wanted to meet internal gender quotas to improve its diversity optics.
And the cruelty of the anecdote, as Riker frames it, is the timing.
Right, because at the exact same time James is dealing with this massive career setback, he's going through a devastating divorce.
A total life upheaval.
Yeah. And when he turns to his company's human resources department, which theoretically exists to support employee well-being, he receives zero emotional support. They essentially just suggest he take unpaid time off.
Which doesn't help his financial situation during a divorce.
Not at all. Riker uses this to highlight the absolute lack of institutional empathy for men in crisis. If James were a woman going through a divorce and dealing with workplace discrimination, Riker argues, the institutional response would be entirely different.
It illustrates multiple layers of his thesis. Institutional bias, prioritizing gender optics over merit, the family court system's toll on men, and the corporate world's total indifference to male emotional struggles.
A bleak picture.
It is. But then he contrasts the quiet, grinding desperation of James with an explosive, life-ruining scenario. He introduces the case study of a college student named Jack.
This one is chilling. Jack is falsely accused of sexual assault on a college campus.
Yes. And Riker details how, despite a complete lack of evidence, Jack's life is systematically dismantled. He is expelled, his academic career is destroyed, his reputation is ruined, and his life is completely derailed.
Without any due process.
The key here is that it all happens without any semblance of due process. Riker emphasizes the asymmetry in the institutional response. Jack's accuser faced absolutely zero consequences for the false allegation. The institution just moved on, leaving Jack as acceptable collateral damage.
Riker uses that to essentially say that institutions have been programmed to view men as disposable. They're acceptable casualties in the pursuit of a broader ideological goal.
Exactly.
And that perfectly sets up part 2 of the book, where he tries to figure out exactly what that ideological goal is and where it originated. He takes us through the evolution and critique of feminist ideologies.
The very detailed history.
Very. And he opens this section with a massive rhetorical grenade. He uses a quote from Pat Robertson, a highly extreme quote, where Robertson claims feminism is an anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, destroy capitalism, and practice witchcraft.
It's an incredibly jarring quote to read in a modern context.
Witchcraft?
Really? I know, right? But it's crucial to understand why Riker includes it. He isn't necessarily saying he agrees with Robertson's literal interpretation of women practicing witchcraft.
Okay, good.
He uses it to immediately establish the sheer divisiveness and the historical intensity of the debate surrounding feminism. He's showing the reader that from its inception, feminism has provoked extreme reactions precisely because it proposes extreme alterations to the foundational structures of society.
It's a framing device.
Exactly. From there, he steps back and provides a historical taxonomy of the movement. He breaks it down into its distinct waves to show how we arrived at our current cultural moment, starting with the first wave.
Right, the first wave. Figures like Mary Wollstonecraft, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Now, Riker actually acknowledges that this initial phase made logical sense, right?
He does.
It was focused on concrete legal rights. It was about women seeking the vote, achieving legal status as equal citizens, and owning property. It was a targeted, tangible movement for political enfranchisement.
He concedes that the first wave was rooted in classical liberal ideas of equality under the law. But then he traces the pivot, the second wave,
The 1960s.
beginning in the 1960s with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and figures like Gloria Steinem. This is where Riker argues the fundamental focus shifted. It moved away from legal equality and toward cultural and social engineering.
So, changing how people actually live day to day.
Exactly. This wave wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about altering traditional gender roles, fundamentally changing family structures, and gaining control over reproduction with the legalization of abortion and the contraceptive pill.
He also notes the emergence of radical feminism here, right?
Yes, specifically the introduction of the concept that the personal is political. Riker argues this idea fundamentally changed the game.
How so?
It blurred the lines between private family life and public political activism. It posited the idea that society itself, down to the interactions in a marriage bed, was inherently male-dominated and oppressive.
And then things get even more abstract in the 1990s with the third wave. He defines this as a shift toward hyper-individualism and the birth of intersectionality.
Well, let's define intersectionality briefly, as Riker critiques it.
Please do.
It's the framework that different aspects of a person's social and political identities, gender, race, class, sexuality, combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege.
Okay.
Riker argues that the third wave used this framework to reject universal truths and biological realities, arguing instead that gender is entirely a social construct. He points out that this made the movement incredibly complex, fragmented, and heavily focused on policing language and identity.
Which naturally bleeds into the fourth wave, our current era. This is driven by digital activism, social media, and movements like Me Too.
Right.
Riker acknowledges that Me Too brought attention to some real abuses of power, but he fiercely critiques the movement for institutionalizing a presumption of guilt. He argues it completely abandoned the concept of due process, linking it right back to the story of Jack on the college campus.
And this historical tracing is essentially the setup for his counter-arguments. Having mapped out the ideology, Riker systematically attacks the mainstream factual claims that modern feminism uses to justify its continued institutional influence.
The big ones.
The most prominent one he takes on is the wage gap.
Oh, the 77 cents to the dollar statistic. It's everywhere.
It is ubiquitous. But Riker argues this statistic is fundamentally flawed and deliberately misleading. And he doesn't just give his opinion, he cites research from the American Association of University Women, which is hardly a right-wing think tank.
Right. What does that data actually say when you break it down?
Riker details how, when you look at the raw data, yes, there is an aggregate earnings gap. But when you actually adjust for variables like job selection, meaning men often choose higher paying but higher risk or physically demanding fields like engineering or resource extraction, while women often cluster in lower paying fields like education or care work, the gap starts to shrink.
Makes sense.
Then you factor in years of continuous experience, hours worked per week, and educational choices. Once all those variables are accounted for, Riker points out that the 77-cent gap shrinks considerably, almost to the point of statistical insignificance.
So his argument is that the raw data is being manipulated to suggest a systemic, malicious discrimination by the patriarchy, when in reality it reflects different aggregate life and career choices made freely by men and women.
Exactly. He applies that same critical lens to the statistics surrounding sexual assault. Now, this is obviously a highly sensitive topic, but Riker tackles it head on.
He targets the 1 in 4 statistic, right?
Yes. The widely cited statistic that 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted during their college years, which originates from a highly influential study by Mary Koss.
How does he debunk a study that is cited by basically every university administration in the country?
He argues that Koss's research relies on deeply flawed methodologies. Specifically, he critiques the study for using overly broad definitions of assault. He points out that the survey categorized certain interactions as sexual assault that the participants themselves stated they did not view as assault.
Oh.
Furthermore, he critiques the heavy reliance on self-reported survey data, which he argues is vulnerable to interpretation bias.
Yeah.
Riker's core point here is that institutions are building draconian, anti-male policies like the ones that ruined Jack's life based on inflated numbers, designed to create a state of perpetual panic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Riker points out that this perceived overreach, these flawed methodologies, haven't just sparked backlash from traditional conservatives. He focuses on the rise of counter-movements led by people who actually originated from within the feminist or progressive camps.
Yes, he brings up Warren Farrell as a prime example.
A fascinating guy.
Warren Farrell was once a highly prominent feminist. He served on the board of the National Organization for Women in New York. Right. But over time, he realized the movement was actively ignoring men's issues, like male suicide rates and workplace fatalities, and he eventually left to become a leading men's rights activist.
He also points to Christina Hoff-Sommers. She identifies as an equity feminist, meaning she supports the first wave goals of legal equality, but she fiercely critiques modern feminism for its obsession with victimhood and what she sees as an overt hostility toward men.
Riker uses figures like Farrell and Summers to prove a very specific point, that the critique of modern feminism isn't just a reactionary right-wing phenomenon. It's coming from rationalists and former insiders who see the ideology going off the rails and losing its connection to empirical reality.
And going off the rails isn't just some abstract cultural phenomenon, it has concrete structural consequences. Which brings us to part 3, the infiltration of institutions. Riker argues that these ideologies didn't just float in the cultural ether, they systematically captured the very institutions that govern our lives.
And he starts with the education system.
He does, and the statistics he pulls here to demonstrate ideological capture are staggering. For instance, he notes that in 2020, Harvard University offered over 40 courses related to gender and feminist studies, while offering only 20 dedicated to American history.
Let that sink in. Double the amount of resources dedicated to gender theory compared to the foundational history of the country.
It's a huge shift.
Riker uses this to illustrate a massive shift in academic priorities, moving away from objective foundational knowledge and toward ideological indoctrination. But he points out that this starts way before university.
Long before, he looks at the demographic shift in K-12 education, noting that roughly 76% of public school teachers in the United States are women. Riker argues this isn't just a harmless demographic quirk, it has fundamentally altered the learning environment to the detriment of boys. According to Riker, the system has been entirely feminized. This means it rewards behaviors that are typically associated with girls sitting still for long periods, passive compliance, heavy reliance on verbal communication, and emotional processing. At the same time, it actively penalizes natural boyish behavior.
The physical stuff.
Exactly. Roughhousing, physical competitiveness, high energy, a reluctance to sit at a desk for 6 hours. These are now treated almost as pathologies. They are viewed as behavioral issues requiring disciplinary action or, very frequently, medication like Adderall or Ritalin, rather than being understood as natural expressions of male development.
He literally calls this a war on boys, and he backs it up with research showing boys are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities, more likely to be suspended, and less likely to graduate high school under this current educational regime.
But the absolute pinnacle of his critique on education has to be his analysis of higher academia, specifically the Peter Boghossian hoax.
Oh, yes. I loved this part of the book. It reads like a comedy, but the implications are terrifying.
It really is incredible. So Professor Peter Boghossian and 2 colleagues wanted to test the academic rigor of modern grievance studies, departments like gender studies, queer theory, and fat studies.
Right.
They deliberately wrote a series of completely absurd, nonsensical academic papers. They used the dense, impenetrable jargon of these fields to argue completely ridiculous premises.
We have to mention the dog park paper.
You do.
One of the papers they submitted literally argued that dog parks are petri dishes for canine rape culture and suggested that men could reduce their inherent toxic masculinity by being trained like dogs.
It was a complete joke.
They submitted these hoax papers to leading peer-reviewed academic journals in the field.
And the journals accepted them?
They didn't just accept them, they praised them. The peer reviewers commended the authors for their insightful analysis of power dynamics. Riker uses this to devastating effect. He argues it is the ultimate proof that in these fields, ideological conformity has completely replaced academic rigor and empirical truth.
The methodology didn't matter.
The journals didn't care that the science or logic was non-existent, because the paper supported the predetermined narrative that men are bad, society is oppressive, and power dynamics govern everything it was published and celebrated.
It perfectly encapsulates his point about the erosion of objective standards. And he traces how that erosion bleeds directly out of the university and into the legal system and the corporate world. Let's look at family law, which Riker views as essentially a hostile entity toward men. He points specifically to the advent of no-fault divorce.
Let's define that briefly. No-fault divorce, which became standard in the late 20th century, allows either spouse to dissolve a marriage without having to prove any wrongdoing, like abuse or adultery, by the other party. Now, while this was heavily championed by feminists as a necessary liberation for women to escape toxic marriages, Riker argues it has systematically disadvantaged men.
How does he argue that it became a trap specifically for men?
Because, according to Riker, the family courts still operate on outdated assumptions about male providers, even while the culture has supposedly moved on. He argues that under no-fault divorce, men are routinely stripped of their assets and separated from their children through heavily biased custody courts that overwhelmingly favor mothers.
The walking ATM machine concept.
Yes. He frames the legal system as viewing fathers primarily as financial utilities required to pay alimony and child support rather than essential, equal parents. He argues this has created a devastating epidemic of single-parent households.
And in the corporate world, he argues the exact same ideological capture is happening through HR departments. He talks about workplace quotas, highlighting the Norwegian mandate that required public companies to have 40% female board members.
A literal quota.
Right. Riker argues that this explicitly prioritizes a diversity checklist over true meritocracy. It's a system that dictates that what you are is far more important than what you can actually do.
And he emphasizes that if you dare to point this out, the institutional immune system will crush you. He brings up the famous case of James Damore, the Google engineer.
Right. Damore wrote an internal memo, and it wasn't some unhinged rant. He was actually responding to a request for feedback on the company's diversity programs.
He was asked to write it.
Exactly. He wrote a memo questioning the efficacy of those policies, and he cited evolutionary psychology to suggest that biological differences in interests, not necessarily systemic sexism, might account for some of the gender disparities in the tech industry. For instance, suggesting that men, on aggregate, might be more interested in working with things and systems, while women might be more interested in working with people.
And for stating a hypothesis backed by standard psychological literature, he was summarily fired. The media vilified him. Riker uses Damore as the ultimate cautionary tale. The modern corporation demands absolute ideological fealty. Nuance, debate, and scientific facts are now fireable offenses if they contradict the diversity narrative.
Which perfectly brings us to part 4 of the book. Riker realizes that all of these things, the firing of Damore, the dog park hoax, the hostility of family courts, aren't isolated incidents. He diagnoses the underlying pathology driving all of this, and he calls it the woke mind virus and the ensuing cancel culture.
And it's important to note that Riker doesn't just use woke as a lazy pejorative buzzword. He attempts to define it structurally for the reader. He views wokeism as a quasi-religious, ideological descendant of Marxism.
Can you unpack that connection? How does he get from Marxism to modern HR departments?
Classical Marxism focused entirely on economic class struggle, the workers versus the owners, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. But Riker argues that wokeism swaps out economic class for identity.
So race, gender, sexuality.
Right. It creates a rigid hierarchy of victimhood based on those traits. And just like any strict fundamentalist religion, it demands total, absolute ideological purity from its adherents and from the society it seeks to control. You are either an ally or an oppressor. There is no middle ground.
It's an ideological purity test that you can never permanently pass because the rules are always changing. He uses a modified Winston Churchill quote to set the stage for this section. He adapts the old saying about liberals and conservatives to say, if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 40, you have no brain. But what about the woke? They seem to have neither.
It's a biting critique. He's suggesting that this new ideology abandons both the compassion of traditional liberalism and the logical pragmatism of conservatism in favor of pure power acquisition and strict conformity. And he backs this up with some of the most famous or infamous cultural flashpoints of the last decade.
Yes, let's look at a few of those. He points to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College. This is a perfect example of what Riker is talking about. Brett Weinstein was a lifelong, deeply progressive biology professor. He supported Bernie Sanders. But he objected to a day of absence on campus where white students and faculty were essentially told to leave the campus for the day.
And he objected specifically on the grounds of true egalitarianism. He argued that telling people they cannot be in a public space based on the color of their skin is fundamentally racist, regardless of who is doing the telling.
But because he stood on that principle, he was accused of racism. The students literally took over the campus. The college president was held hostage in his office by a mob of students, and the administration completely abandoned Weinstein. He had to flee the campus for his own physical safety. Riker points to this as mob rule disguised as social justice, where institutional leaders entirely capitulated to radicalized students.
Then Riker points to J.K. Rowling. Here's a woman, arguably one of the most successful authors in history, who has donated millions to progressive causes. She simply expressed concern on social media about the erasure of biological sex and the potential impact of certain transgender ideologies on women's rights and sex-segregated safety spaces, like domestic abuse shelters.
Right, she was stating what, until about 5 minutes ago, historically speaking, was considered basic, undeniable biological reality.
Exactly. And for that, she was instantly slapped with the label TRF, trans-exclusionary radical feminist, and subjected to a sustained, vicious, global campaign of cancellation. Actors whose careers she launched turned against her. Riker uses her case to show that no amount of previous progressive credibility, wealth, or status can save you if you violate the new woke dogma. The virus consumes its own.
And it isn't just individuals being consumed, it's the legacy institutions themselves that are capitulating to the mob. Riker brings up the massive controversy at the New York Times over the Tom Cotton op-ed. Senator Tom Cotton wrote an opinion piece arguing for the use of military force to quell the violent riots that were happening in cities across America during the summer of 2020.
Now, whether you agree with Cotton's policy proposal or not, publishing the opinion of a sitting U.S. senator on a matter of national importance is the textbook definition of what a newspaper of record is supposed to do. It fosters public debate.
But the internal staff at the Times revolted. Dozens of young staffers claimed that the mere publication of the piece literally endangered their lives. And rather than standing by the principle of free speech, the Times management completely capitulated. They retracted their support for the piece, apologized, and essentially ousted the opinion editor, James Bennett. Riker argues this proves the legacy media is no longer interested in open debate or journalistic integrity. They are entirely captured by internal activists demanding censorship.
And Riker takes it a step further to show what happens when this ideology isn't just policing language, but is actually put into practice in the real world. He highlights the CHAZ or CHAP autonomous zone in Seattle. Activists literally took over a section of the city, chased out the police, and declared it a police-free utopian autonomous zone.
And how did that work out?
It rapidly devolved into violence, extortion, property destruction, and ultimately multiple tragic shootings, including the death of a teenager. Riker points to the CHAZ as the ultimate, undeniable example of reality violently clashing with utopian ideology. When you remove order and implement anarchy disguised as equity, the result is chaos.
So how does this virus spread so effectively? How did we get to a point where a biology professor is chased off campus and the New York Times fires its own editor for publishing a senator? Riker points the finger directly at social media and the architecture of the digital world. He notes a staggering statistic. The average user spends 2.5 hours a day on these platforms.
That is 2.5 hours every single day marinating in algorithmic echo chambers. And Riker emphasizes that these algorithms are explicitly designed to amplify outrage and reward conformity. This digital environment allows virtue signaling influencers to thrive. They aren't doing deep thinking. They are performing their morality for likes and, more importantly, to avoid becoming the target of the digital mob themselves.
He also critiques the legal infrastructure that enables this entire ecosystem, specifically Section 230 protections in the United States. Now, for listeners who might not be deep into tech law, can you unpack what Section 230 is and why Riker believes it's at the core of the problem?
Absolutely. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was written in the early days of the internet. It essentially provides a liability shield. It distinguishes between a publisher and a platform. A publisher, like a newspaper, curates and edits its content so it can be sued for defamation if it prints a lie. A platform, like a telephone company, just transmits the data. They don't control what people say on the phone, so they can't be sued for it.
So social media companies claim to be platforms.
Exactly. Companies like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube claim they are neutral platforms, which gives them immunity from being sued for what their users post. But Riker argues they are having their cake and eating it too. Because they actively curate feeds, write algorithms that suppress certain viewpoints, and ban users based on arbitrary, often ideologically driven terms of service, they are actually acting as publishers. Riker argues they hide behind Section 230 to protect their massive profits, while actively shaping the cultural consciousness and pushing a specific ideological narrative. They are immune from liability while exercising unprecedented control over public discourse.
Whether you agree with his premise or not, Riker is trying to give you a framework to understand why the world feels so crazy right now. He's saying it's not random. It's a top-down structural shift driven by technology and unchecked ideology. But if that's the macro-level cultural chaos, the virus infecting the institutions, what does this mean for the micro-level? What does it mean for the everyday lives of men? That brings us to part 5, navigating relationships and what Riker controversially terms the marriage plantation.
Yes, and Riker argues that the cultural conditioning we just discussed has created a massive, inescapable double bind for men in their personal lives. He aggressively attacks the current cultural narratives surrounding the myth of toxic masculinity.
Right, he said society tells men they must be the stoic, strong providers, the traditional rock that a family relies on. But simultaneously, modern culture and modern therapy speak demand that they be vulnerable, open, and emotionally fluid.
And here is the brutal trap Riker identifies. When men actually do listen to the culture and show that vulnerability when they let their guard down, cry, or express deep fear or weakness to their partners, they are very often met not with empathy, but with contempt. Riker cites numerous psychological observations suggesting that women, even those who consider themselves progressive, often experience a loss of attraction when their male partners display too much vulnerability.
So men are penalized for doing exactly what the culture told them to do.
Precisely. It leaves men paralyzed. They are unable to succeed under either the traditional set of rules or the modern set of rules. And when these fraught relationships inevitably break down under that pressure, Riker argues the institutional system is waiting to exploit them. This is where he introduces that highly provocative concept of the marriage plantation.
Yeah, that is a heavy, heavy term.
Yeah.
It's clearly meant to shock the reader.
It is entirely designed to be provocative. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is using that term to describe the modern reality of traditional marriage under the current regime of family law we discussed earlier. He argues that because the courts are so fundamentally biased against men awarding primary custody and significant alimony to women in the vast majority of cases, marriage has literally become a legal trap.
He describes it almost like indentured servitude, right?
He does. He argues that men act as the labor force. They generate the resources and build the wealth. But they have no actual unalienable rights to the fruits of their labor or guaranteed access to their own children if the woman decides to end the contract via no-fault divorce. Because the state will enforce the division of assets and the removal of the children with the threat of police violence, he views modern marriage not as a romantic union, but as a system of indentured servitude backed by the state.
Because the stakes are so high and the system is so rigorously rigged against them, Riker advocates for a complete redefinition of partnerships. He explicitly tells men to look for alternatives to state-sanctioned marriage.
He explores several alternatives. He talks about cohabitation agreements where financial terms and asset divisions are clearly defined by private contract outside of the family court jurisdiction. He briefly touches on polyamory or non-monogamy as an alternative structure that rejects traditional ownership models. But primarily, he emphasizes shared parenting models and relationships based on mutual practical goals, rather than just fleeting romantic entanglements.
He gives a great anecdote about this that really grounded the idea for me. He talks about a couple who essentially bypassed the traditional romantic script and built their relationship around starting a sustainability business together.
Yes, their bond was forged in shared purpose. They had shared values, a mutual contribution to a tangible project, and a clear division of labor based on competence. Their partnership relied on this mutual practical goal, rather than relying on a broken, state-enforced institutional contract. Riker's telling men to be hyper-pragmatic, protect your assets, protect your legal rights, and build relationships on a foundation of stark reality, not romanticized fiction pushed by Hollywood.
And that pragmatic, highly proactive approach extends to how men need to view themselves, not just in relationships, but in society at large. In part 6, Riker shifts gears. He moves from diagnosing the problem to offering a path forward. He titles this section, Reclaiming Male Creativity, Leadership, and Stewardship.
He starts this section by attacking a very specific cultural stereotype that he believes has taken root. The idea that men are uncreative, purely logical, emotionless drones who just build spreadsheets and start wars.
Right. He says society views men as uncreative, but how does he actually disprove that?
He brings in heavy hitters from history to prove the stereotype is completely absurd. He points out that men have been the primary architects of beauty, narrative, and high culture throughout human history. He points to Homer, weaving the foundational myths of Western civilization. He points to J.R.R. Tolkien.
Tolkien is such a perfect example for his argument.
He is. Riker notes that Tolkien wasn't just some academic daydreaming in an ivory tower. He was a veteran of the horrific, muddy, bloody trench warfare of World War I. He experienced unimaginable trauma and loss. And what did he do with that masculine experience of war? He channeled his understanding of courage, loyalty, and facing overwhelming darkness into the timeless, deeply moving myth of the Lord of the Rings. Riker lists other modern visionaries too, like George Lucas building modern mythology with Star Wars, Giorgio Armani redefining aesthetics, and Martin Scorsese exploring the depths of the human condition on film.
He even brings in hard science to back this up, right? He cites a neurobiology study.
Yes, he cites a neurobiology study by Samir Zeki on creativity, which intrinsically links the creative process to human emotion. Riker argues that by telling men to suppress their emotions or by pathologizing their natural drives, society is actively stifling their innate creative potential. His point is that when men are allowed to channel their rich internal lives and their drive for order, they literally build worlds.
And speaking of building worlds, the next thing he says men must fundamentally reclaim is leadership.
This is a core pillar of his red-pilled framework. Riker takes an unapologetic stance that society doesn't just benefit from male leadership, it absolutely needs it to survive, period. And he does a fascinating sociological comparison here to prove his point. He looks at traditional patriarchal communities, specifically the Amish.
The Amish?
Yeah.
That's an unexpected pivot.
It seems like it, but it works perfectly for his data set. Despite living surrounded by a modern, chaotic world, the Amish maintain strict traditional gender roles. They have clear, unapologetic male leadership in the church, the community, and the family. And what is the sociological result of that strict patriarchy? Extremely low crime rates, high community cohesion, virtually zero homelessness, and incredibly strong, resilient family bonds.
And he contrasts that stability with what's happening in mainstream society. He pulls a devastating statistic from the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yes, he contrasts the Amish with the DOJ statistic that 70% of youth in state correctional facilities lack a father at home.
Wait, 70%? That is a massive correlation.
It's undeniable, and it forms the crux of his argument for leadership. Riker argues that male leadership, specifically fatherhood, provides essential order, firm boundaries, and moral direction. When that male leadership is removed, marginalized, or actively vilified by feminist policies and family courts, a massive vacuum is created in the community. And Riker points out that this vacuum is rarely filled by positive, progressive forces. It's almost always filled by gangs, crime, and chaos.
Because young men, in particular, crave structure. They crave hierarchy and role models.
Exactly. If they don't get that structure from a strong father figure in the home, they will seek it out in the streets. Therefore, Riker concludes that deliberately dismantling male leadership isn't progressing society. It is actively destroying its foundational safety mechanisms.
He extends this concept of male stewardship to the physical world as well, specifically environmentalism. Now, we often hear environmentalism framed through a very feminine Mother Earth lens. It's often about nurturing and passive coexistence. But Riker points out that men have unique, highly practical strengths to bring to conservation.
He highlights programs that harness masculine energy for ecological good. He points to Veterans Green Jobs, a program that channels the logistical, tactical, and highly disciplined skills of military men into green technology and large-scale conservation efforts. He also praises the Men's Shed movement in Australia.
I hadn't heard of that one. What is the Men's Shed movement?
It's a network of community spaces where men can gather to work on practical, hands-on projects. They might be building furniture, repairing machinery, or, in the context of stewardship, building nesting boxes for local wildlife or repairing community infrastructure. Riker is showing that when you engage men on their own terms, using their natural drive for practical problem-solving, camaraderie, and physical stewardship, they are an incredible force for positive change in the physical world.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've covered the crisis, the history of feminism, the institutional capture, the woke virus, the marriage plantation, and the need to reclaim leadership. So what does this all mean? We arrive at the outro. What is Riker's ultimate synthesis for the reader?
Riker is essentially offering his readers a complete paradigm shift. He's asking them to adopt what he calls a red-pilled framework.
And he's not just using that as a matrix internet meme.
No, it's a serious philosophical stance for him. It's a call to view the world with cold, hard rationality. He wants men to actively strip away the emotional manipulation of progressive narratives and see the power dynamics for what they actually are. He's urging men to build resilient mental models. He tells his audience, you can't just complain on the internet about the system being rigged. You have to understand the system, anticipate its institutional biases, and maneuver through it with intelligence, stoicism, and strength.
His final call to action is essentially for men to stop apologizing for being men. He wants them to lead by example, to embrace an unapologetically patriarchal mindset. And again, he clarifies this isn't in the sense of tyranny or abuse, but in the sense of taking ultimate heavy responsibility for their families and their communities. He wants men to act with rational purpose to restore the balance that he believes has been disastrously lost.
And as we wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. This is something that simmers just beneath the surface of Riker's entire book. We didn't explicitly debate this today, but it is the logical endpoint of his historical analysis. If the traditional narratives of history, the building of our institutions, the discovery of our science, the creation of our art, the forging of our laws, if all of these were truly built on a necessary balance of both male and female constitutions and their distinct evolutionary strengths, what happens to the long-term survival of a society if it decides to entirely erase, vilify, or suppress one half of that equation in the name of ideological progress? Can a civilization actually sustain itself if it treats the biological architects of its own foundations as enemies?
That is the question Riker is daring his readers to ask. And it is an incredibly heavy one to ponder. If this deep dive sparked your interest, if you want to see the raw data, read the extended anecdotes, and explore the history for yourself, you need to read the source material. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Beyond Feminism, Restoring Balance in Institutions by Conrad Riker. Dive into the text and decide for yourself whether his framework holds up.
And don't forget to follow the author's ongoing work and commentary. You can find him on Substack at Conrad Riker. That's ConradNriker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive intellectual journey today. Please do us a final favor and hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe to the channel to help us grow and ensure you never miss our next deep dive. We'll see you next time.